All right, everybody, you just tuned into Random Radio. Welcome to another episode of Just Ask, the podcast where you ask the questions and we give you the answers. I'm your host, Nicholas John Random, and we are once again live at the Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in beautiful Durango, Colorado. Today's podcast is going to be about one of the biggest conspiracy theories in the last 100 years here in America. Now, our question today comes from Wayne. Wayne sent us an email with a one-liner. It simply says, "Who really killed JFK?" So that's what we're going to do today, guys. We're going to talk all about the conspiracy theory of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, it was pretty much guaranteed that we were going to do this one eventually. We do a lot of conspiracy theories and strange topics on this show, so we might as well get it out of the way early. I think in the 2000s they took a report that still says 80% of Americans still believe that there was a conspiracy hidden or covered up when it comes to the JFK assassination. So it was a matter of time before we got to this one. Now, I'm pretty sure that I have a pretty solid grasp on what actually happened, but a lot of people don't. So we are going to do this podcast today to explore all the different theories, everything we know about the assassination, and see if we can inform the masses a little bit. So just like I try to say before every podcast, I need it to be very clear that this podcast is 100% my opinion. It's the opinion of one man based on the knowledge that I have, that I've been able to find, that the research I've done in my own time. It's based off of my opinion and my opinion alone. So please, nobody take too much offense and get all aggravated over this silly little podcast. If you don't like my opinions or don't want to hear me talk, change the channel, guys. Push a little button, go to a different podcast. It's not that big of a deal. Click over to something else. If you happen to be curious about the things I have to say and you want to keep listening, well, all right. Thank you. I appreciate the support. So I'm just going to start simply, talk a little bit about the actual assassination and what happened. So for you younger people out there who don't know what I'm talking about as far as the assassination of JFK, well, John F. Kennedy was the 35th president of the United States of America. And in 1963, he was assassinated by gunshot in Dallas, Texas. It was a big deal at the time. It was one of the saddest days in American history. John F. Kennedy was very well loved and received by the people. He was trying to do good things for the country, make some good changes. And a lot of politics and people in politics and, a lot of people who were part of the status quo didn't really like him that much because he was trying to make changes. There's a lot of familiarity with a lot of situations going on in the world right now with JFK trying to change things. Him and his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was also later assassinated, were both, they were trying to make some good changes. And unfortunately, they might have been killed for it, but we're not going to go down that road. We're going to start off with just the assassination. So on Friday, November 22nd, in 1963, at around 12:30 p.m., estimated, the President of the United States of America was driving in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. He was in the vehicle with the governor at the time of Texas and his wife and the governor's wife. And he was shot, supposedly, by Lee Harvey Oswald with a rifle in the head and died. Now, there were 3 shots, again, supposedly. There were 3 shots from the rifle that Mr. Oswald fired. One of them hit the governor. One of them missed, pretty sure, and one of them hit the president in the head and killed him. This is the status quo. This is what the Warren Commission investigated and concluded, was that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots. 2 of them hit their targets. 1 of them killed the president of the United States of America. The president was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital. About 30 minutes after the shooting, he was pronounced dead. An autopsy wasn't done until later, much later. But Mr. Oswald, the supposed shooter, was fleeing the scene. A police officer named Tippett came across him, and he shot the officer and killed the officer. And then he was cornered and arrested. And then later, while they were moving Mr. Oswald to an armored car, a gentleman named Jack Ruby, who was pretending to be a reporter, came out of the crowd with a revolver and shot Mr. Oswald in the stomach. Oswald died from his wounds. Jack Ruby was arrested for the murder of Oswald, and then later died. He did a court case, and then he later died in a hospital from cancer. So these are the players. This is the situation. The President of the United States was assassinated. There was a supposed shooter, Mr. Oswald. Mr. Oswald eventually gets caught. When he gets caught, he's arrested, and while he's being moved, Mr. Jack Ruby shows up and shoots Mr. Oswald. So all the players, and then Ruby dies in a hospital of cancer. So all the players die, unfortunately, which makes, conspiracies go even crazier because nobody's around. Let's just talk about the situation for what it is. So let's talk about our players. Mr. John F. Kennedy. So Kennedy, like I said, he was trying to make a lot of changes with the status quo, but there were a lot of people who didn't like that. And when I say a lot of people, I mean his own government didn't like what he was doing. The mafia didn't like what he was doing. The Teamsters, the Russians, the Cubans, a lot of people didn't like what he and his brother were doing. So obviously conspiracy theories were abound. The other thing that didn't help was the Warren Commission's investigation. There were some strange things about the actual case involving the bullets and the way they shot into the car that didn't make 100% sense, and there was some weird stuff about, a magic bullet theory and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of it only fueled the numerous conspiracy theories abound. But let's just start with some of the players. So Kennedy, we know a lot about Kennedy. He was the president of the United States, and I'll go into some of the things he was doing. But we're going to start with the bad guy players. So let's start with Oswald. Okay, so what do we know about Mr. Lee Harvey Oswald, the supposed shooter of the President of the United States? Well, we actually know a lot about him. Oswald was a strange guy. He was a weird guy. And he was in the military when he was young. When he was in the military, he had a terrible, terrible record. Multiple times he was put on reprimand for firing guns when he wasn't supposed to. He was put on reprimand once for firing a gun and shooting himself accidentally, even though it wasn't his gun. He was put on reprimand for striking an officer. He did not do well in the military. He was a weird guy. There were rumors that he had defected to Russia at one point in time, and he actually met his wife, Marina, who was Russian. So those rumors could have been possibly true. Here's what I think about Mr. Oswald, my personal opinion. We live in a time in this country, unfortunately, where shootings happen quite a lot. There's some bad guys that have gone into schools and shot them up. They've gone into movie theaters and shot them up. They've gone into churches and shot them up. They've shot into crowds in Vegas. We live in a time where access to guns is too easy, and crazy guys like this, they get away with it. They die, sure, they get in trouble, they go to jail, whatever, but they ultimately have killed quite a few people. And back in the 60s, this wasn't as common. This wasn't a common issue. So there was no profile for characters like this. But I can tell you, having studied a lot of these cases, that Oswald fits the profile textbook of all of these shooters, these mass shooters that have been arrested in the last 20 years. 100%. He fits the exact... He wants attention. He's an attention-seeking person who is strange and has very little friends because he's very odd and not very many people like him. So he doesn't have very many friends, but he wants that attention, and he thinks he can get that attention by doing some big, giant move like killing people or killing the president or killing somebody, so that he's remembered always as the guy who killed the bad guy, even if his psychotic brain doesn't realize that he hasn't killed a bad guy, he's killed a good guy. It's a classic scenario, like, the kid who went in and shot up the church, South Baptist Church or whatever. He thought he was doing a good thing. In his own twisted mind, he thought he was doing a good thing. The Columbine kids, in their own twisted mind, they thought they were doing a good thing. They thought they were ridding the world of all their bullies or whatever. They also killed a bunch of innocent people. And that's the part that their brain doesn't comprehend, is just because somebody's a bad guy in their perspective doesn't mean he's a bad guy in the rest of the world's perspective. But the point is Oswald fits that pattern 100%. If you don't understand what I mean is, Oswald actually tried to assassinate another person before the President of the United States. He tried to assassinate General Edwin Walker. Now, General Walker was a terrible, terrible guy. And the reason at the time that Oswald wanted to kill this guy was because he thought he was such a horrible, horrible guy and a racist and promoting all these terrible ideas through politics, which he 100% was. The funny thing about it is Oswald was actually right about this guy, General Walker. He was right about this General Walker guy. General Walker was basically a Nazi living in America. He was a supporter of the KKK and white supremacy, and he did not like the idea of integration in schools that was happening all over the country. He was a real, real bad guy, and Oswald decided he wanted to try and kill him. So Oswald attempted to go to a window and shoot the general through the window, but he missed and he hit the desk, and the general did get an injury from a ricochet from the desk. But my point is, in this scenario, is that at that time, Oswald thought he was going after this guy because he was such a bad guy. And then later on, he assassinates John F. Kennedy. As far as opposites go, you cannot get farther away than General Edwin Walker and John F. Kennedy. Their politics were almost exactly opposite from each other, like 100% opposite. The point is Oswald just was looking for that attention. He was just wanting to be that guy who did something amazing that everybody remembered him for. So he wanted to be the guy who went and assassinated Hitler. And in his mind, General Edwin Walker was that Hitler character. And then later on, it became John F. Kennedy. But his mind wasn't there because those thoughts don't make sense. It was just, he was just all over the place. He was just friend-seeking. He was attention-seeking. So there's times when he's supporting the Cubans and he's supporting communism, and there's times when he's supporting liberalism and the opposite of everything that entails. He just flip-flopped. He was just looking for attention and looking for some sort of acknowledgement, and he was trying to do that through assassination. So the thing about it is, no matter what the conspiracy theories are, personally, I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was there to try and assassinate the president. Now, I don't believe he did. We'll get into that a little bit later. But I do believe he was there to assassinate the president. Now, let's move on to Mr. Jack Ruby. Now, Mr. Jack Ruby is the guy who killed Oswald when Oswald was leaving. Now, this is a very curious character, and the curiosity of Mr. Jack Ruby only made the conspiracy theories go wild, because Jack Ruby was this wild card guy who was born Jewish, from a Jewish family in Chicago, and he became part of the mafia, and he moved to Dallas with a bunch of other mafia guys to actually take over the prostitution ring in Dallas. That's why he moved there. He was a supposed nightclub operator in Dallas. That was his occupation whenever listed. But he did own a nightclub and ran a nightclub, but he was a mafia guy who ran prostitution. That was what he really did. Despite everything else that they've called him, that's what he did. He ran a prostitution ring for the mafia. Now, he was a whack job. The thing is, people have come up with all these theories as to why Jack Ruby killed Oswald after Oswald killed JFK. And they're like, oh, well, the mafia totally wanted JFK dead, so they hired this patsy guy, Oswald, to show up there, and then they hired Jack Ruby to go in there and clean it up by killing Oswald before he could say anything about the mafia. Well, maybe, but doubtful. In my personal opinion, very, very doubtful. From everything that we know about Jack Ruby, he was just freaking crazy. He was just a crazy, crazy guy. He was notorious for being a crazy guy in his own club. Like, one day he'd let you into the club and the next day he would hate you and not let you into the club, having no regard of your actual character whatsoever. He would play card games in nightclubs and rip his shirt off and beat his chest like a gorilla. This guy was, he was a crazy, crazy guy. He had an extremely short fuse. There are reports of something around 40 reports of him beating up clientele in his nightclubs. Like, that's a ridiculous amount of reports of him beating up people in his own nightclub. This guy had a crazy short fuse, and he was all over the place. From his testimony when he talked about why he killed Oswald, and from the testimony of people who knew him, he, as coming from a Jewish family, he very much liked John F. Kennedy. He liked his politics, which is really rare. He talked about politics all the time and how everybody was doing all sorts of things that were wrong, but he really liked JFK, like very much liked JFK. And he liked the things JFK was doing when it came to the anti-Semitics. Like JFK was trying to integrate and make the Americans, a better culture where we indoctrinate everybody. Everybody's it doesn't matter which religion you are, what color you are. That was what JFK was about, and it was really, really good. And Jack Ruby liked that. He really, really liked that. It's also very probable that Jack Ruby was homosexual, which, again, has nothing to do with his character, but it does have to do with his politics. As a homosexual, you would probably like JFK because, again, JFK was very including. It was the 60s, and it was not acceptable to be a homosexual, and it definitely wasn't acceptable to be a homosexual mobster. So Jack Ruby was all over the place, but when in his testimonies, he broke down in tears when they were talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's most likely that when he found out that Oswald killed JFK, he was so broken up that he decided to use his connections, which he had many of, to get in and kill Oswald of his own volition. When I say connections, what I mean is this. Jack Ruby, like I said, his job in Dallas was prostitution. That's what he did. A number of his clients happened to be police officers. He also sold drugs and did all sorts of stuff, and a number of his clients in Dallas were police officers. So the reason Jack Ruby was able to get in, because people question this all the time, how was Jack Ruby able to, while they were moving a presidential assassination treasonous prisoner, while they were moving him to an armored car, how did Jack Ruby get in there with a gun? Well, the reason he got in there, in fact, one of the police officers is even recorded acknowledging him because he recognized him after he killed Oswald. He was able to get in there because he knew all the cops. He had been to that police station dozens and dozens of times. The police officers in Dallas, a lot of them were his clients for prostitution or drugs or a number of other things. This was the 60s, guys. And things weren't as tight as they are now. You could get away with a lot more back as a police officer back then, especially a police officer in the South. And, well, they did. So whenever Jack Ruby showed up there, he got himself in, and he got himself up close and personal with Oswald, and he shot him. That's what happened. But his motives, in my personal opinion, seem to be his own. It seems to be that he wanted to kill Oswald because he was really, really upset with the fact that John F. Kennedy had been shot. He really loved JFK, and he wanted to be the one who killed JFK's murderer. So that's Mr. Jack Ruby. Now, let's move on to some of the conspiracy theories. Now, there are conspiracy theories galore, from aliens to the mafia to everything you can possibly imagine. So, where are we going to start? Let's start with the U.S. government. Now, the U.S. government might have killed JFK. This is a very popular theory. When I say the U.S. government, specifically, I mean the CIA. There's a very big theory that says the CIA conspired to kill Kennedy. Now you're saying, why would his own government want to kill the president? Well, there's a number of reasons when it comes to Kennedy and the CIA. So during Kennedy's presidency, there was the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So they put all these, the government put all, the CIA, specifically the CIA, put all these ducks into the Bay of Pigs, this revolutionary scenario where the Cubans were supposed to overthrow Castro. Well, the Bay of Pigs failed miserably, and Kennedy pulled out about halfway, and it was a huge fiasco. And unfortunately, what happened is a lot of the guys that the CIA had been training in Cuba, the refugees in Cuba that the CIA had gone down there and worked with, and they'd been training them to overthrow Castro. A lot of those guys died after the Bay of Pigs because we just backed out of that whole scenario, and it was a big giant fiasco, and Castro obviously wasn't overthrown. The CIA was pissed. They were pissed about this because in their view it was Kennedy's fault that they messed up in the Bay of Pigs. They were not happy with that scenario. So the whole Vietnam thing was also starting to happen, and the CIA was very worried that Kennedy was going to do the same thing to Vietnam that he had done with Cuba. In other words, he was going to mess up big time and not put in troops to the right places and do all this terrible stuff and allow Vietnam to fall to communism just like Cuba had done. Well, that was kind of stupid anyway because Vietnam turned out to be a big fiasco. But that's another reason, is they were worried that this president was just going to keep messing up when it came to communism. And then there's the most logical reason for this theory, which is after the Bay of Pigs scenario, Kennedy went on a firing spree. He went and just started to clean house in the CIA, which it definitely needed. The problem is he didn't do a good job, and then he was assassinated. He went on a cleaning spree and started firing all these people, and the first person he fired was the director of the CIA, I think his name's Alan Dulles, something like that. Anyway, he was at the time, the director of the CIA, this guy. So a lot of people think that this guy, the old director of the CIA, set into motion the assassination of Kennedy because he was pissed off that he had been fired and that Kennedy was basically cleaning house in a CIA that he had set up. In his view, Kennedy was ruining everything. He had messed up in Bay of Pigs. He was now on a firing spree after Bay of Pigs, firing all the good men that he had gotten into the CIA, and then he fired the director himself. So he was pissed. So a lot of people think that Allen created this scenario where Kennedy was assassinated. Coincidentally, this former director of the CIA was also on the Warren Commission. The funny thing is, a lot of the guys that Kennedy tried to clean house with ended up on the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission is the thing that investigated Kennedy's assassination and death. So it would have been extremely easy for them to manipulate the evidence and things like that to make it seem like other things happened. So the U.S. government could have definitely been responsible for the Kennedy assassination. There's also another theory when it comes to the U.S. government, which is the LBJ theory. LBJ was a hardcore, power-hungry politician. Anybody that's ever met LBJ or knew him, that's how he was. He was a hardcore, politician. He was built like a football player, just a big, tough brute. Bully. He was a bully. And some people believe that either he, on his own volition, or with the backing of the CIA and the other governments, conspired to kill Kennedy so that he could become president. Because after Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ took power. That's how that works. He was the vice president, so he became the president. He got us further into Vietnam. He He did a lot of things that a lot of people didn't like because he was a bully and he just did what he wanted to do. So there's a theory that he took power on purpose. There's also this very weird thing, and I've talked about it a couple times, and I would love to do a whole podcast on it. I'm sure I will at some point. There's a very weird thing involving billions and billions of dollars worth of gold bullion that was found in the White Sands, New Mexico mountain, Victoria Mountain. But that's a whole weird other story and mystery that like I said, I'd love to do a podcast on that some other time. But the point is, the U.S. government could have definitely had to do with his assassination. That's one very possible and interesting theory. The second most popular theory is that it was the mafia. The mafia. Now, why would the mafia want to kill JFK? Well, because Kennedy, both of the Kennedys, JFK and his brother, kind of made a big enemy of the mob. They were very, very actively going after the Teamsters labor union, which, Jimmy Hoffa was running at the time. They were really, really going hard on these guys in organized crime, especially Robert. Robert had been appointed Attorney General. His brother, Robert Kennedy, had been an appointed Attorney General, and they were very, very much going after the mafia and the Teamsters Union and Jimmy Hoffa very publicly. And there's a theory that in combination with the fact that that was going on, the fact that, when the Bay of Pigs fiasco went down, the casinos that had been, basically these mafia guys had been putting all these casinos in Cuba, hoping to make a bunch of money and making it like a new Vegas. They were planning on making a second Vegas in Cuba. And they spent millions and millions of dollars building up all these casinos, these mafia-run casinos. And then the Bay of Pigs fiasco happened, and they lost all their money. They just, the casinos were no longer able to be operated out of U.S., so they lost all that money. So the mafia was pissed at JFK and at Robert Kennedy for, going after them publicly and making them lose a bunch of money because they were trying to get them out of the Teamsters labor union, and because they had lost all this money in Cuba. So there's that popular theory, and like I said before, there's the weird little mafia connection when it comes to Jack Ruby killing Oswald, so people have a tendency to think that Oswald was a patsy, and he was hired to kill the president and then silenced by Jack Ruby. So that is a popular theory. That is a popular theory. Okay, well, now I'm going to tell you the sad truth of the situation. This has been a popular theory for a very long time, and I can tell you it is 100% what I believe happened. There may or may not have been some footage at one point in time that 100% confirmed this scenario, but it has since been destroyed, and I'm not going to go down the road of, getting in too much detail because, it's a dangerous world out there. So I'm just going to say this is a theory like the rest, but in my personal opinion, it is exactly what happened. Like I said before, Oswald, in my opinion, was there to assassinate the president. He was in the book depository. He had opened the window, he brought his rifle, and he did fire 3 shots. Unfortunately, this is the part where it gets a little tricky. Now, he was firing a rifle with full metal jackets. Those are a type of bullet. Now, anybody in the military who knows anything, anybody who's not in the military, anybody who knows anything about guns, knows that full metal jackets have a tendency to go through a target into a second target, which is what happened with one of the bullets. One of the bullets was fired and went into Kennedy and then went into the governor, and the other 2 bullets missed entirely. So here's the scenario, and I want you to remember that there were some eyewitnesses to the account, but all of this happened extremely quick, and with shots being fired, no one would have noticed what was actually going on. So Kennedy was in a motorcade, and with him was the governor and the governor's wife and his wife. Now, in front and in back of Kennedy were Secret Service in their own cars. That's what you do. It's you got to protect the president. Unfortunately for Kennedy, one of the Secret Service agents was carrying an AR-15. Now, it's known that the individual, and I'm not going to use names because I'm not going down that road, but the individual who was a Secret Service agent who was sitting in the seat carrying an AR-15 was not familiar with his weapon. He also was very hungover from a night of drinking, according to reports. He was hungover from a night of drinking before that day, and he had very little experience with an AR-15, an automatic rifle. Now, Oswald took a shot, and the moment the shot happened, and he missed, but the moment the first bullet rang out, the Secret Service started to get into action because they know what bullets sound like. That's their job. And unfortunately, our Secret Service agent stood up at the exact same time the vehicle sped up. The motorcade sped up a little bit, and his hand slipped on his trigger on his AR-15, an automatic rifle, and he shot the president in the head, accidentally. Around the exact same time, Oswald shot his other bullets. Now, basically what I'm telling you is, the President of the United States was shot by friendly fire on accident. Oswald was there to assassinate the President of the United States. He took shots, and during that time, the Secret Service tried to jump into action, and one of the Secret Service agents holding an AR-15 accidentally released his hand on the trigger and shot the president in the head. The bullet that they recovered in the president's skull stayed in his skull, which doesn't usually happen when you shoot somebody with a full metal jacket like Oswald had. It does happen when you get shot with unjacketed rounds, which only the Secret Service were carrying. That's all they were using. People were like, well, why wouldn't they have released this? Well, because they had a patsy. They caught a guy who was trying to kill the president. They had a guy who was trying to kill the president. And then they had this Secret Service agent who was, a good guy. He had a family. He just really messed up in his job. Why would you ruin his life and his career and his family? These are guys that work together. They have become family, essentially, in their little group of work. Why would you ruin his life if you had a admitted guy who was trying to kill the president of the United States? They had a patsy, and when I say patsy, I don't mean like he didn't do anything. This guy was literally trying to kill the president of the United States, and the president died, so they were like, we might as well take that and say, yes, okay, Oswald killed the president, that was it. Then they went crazy with covering things up, and they were super secretive about all the evidence that was around for quite a long time, and the Warren Commission was a joke and all this kind of stuff. There's a very famous search that went on for many, many years called a search for the Babushka lady. The one footage they have, the Zapruder film, that shows that's the one that everybody's seen of the assassination of Kennedy, shows a lady wearing a babushka, like a Russian-style babushka hat or a scarf over her head. She has a camera, and for years and years, people were trying to find out who she was so they could get her footage, because she was the closest to the scene, and that would show exactly what happened, and it was a totally different angle. But they could never find her. Well, they did find her, and they did find that footage very, very quickly. They just didn't want anybody to see that footage. Now, I may or may not have seen that footage, and I can tell you it 100% confirms the fact that the CIA operative accidentally shot the President of the United States by pulling out an AR-15 with his hand on the trigger at the exact same time the motorcade sped up, causing him to release his hand on the trigger and pull that trigger and shoot the president. That's what happened. It was a friendly fire situation, and it was a really terrible, awful situation, and they decided to cover it up. And they covered it up for a very, very long time. It wasn't until recently that this footage may or may not have been released, but it was a popular theory for a very long time. There was a gentleman named Howard Dunhue who wrote a book about it, but I can tell you that's basically what happened to JFK. The answer to the question that we've all been asking for many, many, many years, who shot JFK, was we did. It was an accident. It was friendly fire by accident. While an attempted assassination was happening, we accidentally assassinated him ourselves. That's what happened, and it sucks, but that's what happened. Now, a lot of people aren't going to like that theory, but I just want you to remember what I said at the beginning of the podcast. Everything that I'm saying is my opinion. It's just my opinion. You don't have to like it. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to do anything. But that's where we're at. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. It was an accident. And we're going to leave it at that, guys. I'm your host, Nicholas John Random. I hope this was at least an interesting one. We are once again live at the Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House. If you liked our podcast, click that like button down there. If you feel like supporting us a little bit, head over to our Patreon account and become a supporting member. You can get some early episodes and maybe some swag from over there. It's Patreon/Random Radio. If you got a question for me, and you know I like questions, send them to me any way you can. You can email me at random@cafestimulus.com. You can leave me a comment with a good question. You can leave me a comment on Patreon. Any way you can get me a question. If it's a really good one, then we'll do it. That's going to be it for us tonight, guys, and we will catch you next time on Random Radio. Until then.